Welcome to Big Blend Radio with your hosts, Lisa and Nancy, editors of BigBlendMagazine.com.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio. You know, every first Monday we get to chat with Mike Guardia. Mike is on our show every first Monday, but he often talks about his books because he's an award-winning author, a military historian, and also a U.S. Army veteran. He's also named Author of the Year in 2021 by the Military Writers Society of America. I think he's up to 25 books, so he's always telling stories from his books. His latest ones are The Combat Diaries, True Stories from the Front Lines of World War II, and Coyote Recon, The Forgotten Wars of Colonel J.D. Vanderpool. Telling you, you're going to want to read his books if you haven't already. Go to his website, MikeGuardia.com. Obviously, get him on Amazon, all those great places. But today he's going to give, well, me definitely a history lesson on the Revolutionary War because it's airing on July 3rd. So we're getting into the spirit of Independence Day. And I'm sure a lot of you listening in know a lot more than me, but I'm really glad because Mike is also a history teacher. So welcome back, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Lisa, I'm doing great. Always a pleasure to be on the show.
Well, I'm excited to have a history lesson today. I know we're normally talking about, soldiers and aircraft and, all of that cool stuff in your books, but we need to kind of go back into our history of America of actually becoming independent. And as you know, I grew up in different countries, and so I have some. You got some explaining to do for me, Mike. Help.
Okay.
But I want to get started with this in regards to, we've got the 4th of July, and this is when we became independent. But when you look at the Revolutionary War, it seems to have stretched on for a while. So were we independent before the England said, okay, we acknowledge this, or not?
Yeah, so we were independent in the sense that we had declared it. We had the whole convention where we signed and we worded out the Declaration of Independence, and the whole thing was thrown together at Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1776. That was when we officially declared independence for ourselves. The thing is that we can declare it all we want. It doesn't really become official per se until the mother country formally recognizes it. But for all intents and purposes, we were a declared independent nation in 1776. British finally said enough in 1781, and in 1783 they formally recognized our independence. But we as a country, formally we recognize our date of independence as July 4th, 1776.
Well, they took a long time to recognize that. I mean, is it just because of communication and boats and stuff like that, or was it just like they just wanted to be slow about it?
Well, no, they really just didn't want the American colonies to be independent. And it had been a long time brewing, because for most of the existence of the American colonies, the relationship that they had with England was what we can best describe as salutary neglect. And it's like, hey, we're going to recognize that the people who live in the American colonies are subjects of the British Crown, but we pretty much let them do whatever they want. They can print their own money, they can conduct trade with other nations. The only thing that we ask really at the end of the day is that they recognize Britain as truly being their sovereign. And, that relationship worked very well for much of the colony's existence. We considered ourselves British only in a nominal sense, but we were calling our own shots as to what we did, as far as conducting trade, as far as, governing the aspects of our day-to-day lives. And the thing that really changed that dynamic, oddly enough, was the French and Indian War, which is the name that we apply here in North America to what is in a much broader sense known as the 7 Years' War. And that was where the British and the French were fighting each other, and particularly ground zero of the 7 Years' War was in the American colonies, because the French had colonies here as well. And because the fighting was getting so intense on the American frontier, you had you pretty much had a carousel of British troops who were making their way to the American continent to fight the French contingent. Well, wars cost a lot of money, so when the war was over in 1763 and Britain was declared the winner, they said, okay, well, gosh, this war really cost us a lot of money, so how are we going to recoup the royal bank accounts as they are? Well, hey, we're just going to get the American colonists to pay for it. We're going to say, hey, we're going to start taxing you guys, because, I mean, come on, we did fight a 7-year war here, and we want you to shoulder some of the burden. Well, thing is that the American colonies had never been taxed to that point, and they were probably willing to tolerate it to a point. But the thing is that a lot of the taxes and a lot of the policies that came out throughout the 1760s and into the early 1770s were, by every measure that the American colonists were putting to it, were very repressive and were trampling of the colonial rights. One of the biggest battle cries that they had was no taxation without representation. That was one of the very first pushbacks. They said, hey, we have been enjoying this relationship of salutary neglect forever and a day, and now suddenly you want to tax us. Well, hey, we're not even represented in Parliament, so why are you going to tax us when we don't even have a voice in what happens in the government? Not that taxation with representation is all that much better, but still they felt like they wanted to have a voice. And among the many tax acts that they put towards the colonists, you had the Stamp Act, you had the Tea Act.
Yeah, I was going to ask that the Stamp Act was like,
right.
When I was researching this, they're like, the Stamp Act. I'm like, what? They're going to get mad about stamps, apparently.
Yeah. So what it was is they were these stamps that were attached to any paper product that was printed and circulated throughout the colonies. So it applied to newspapers, it applied to stationery, documents, pretty much anything that you could have a paper-based product attached to would be taxed accordingly. And then not only did you have a lot of these taxes that were coming down, but you also had very unpopular policies such as the Quartering Act, which meant that American colonists had to house British troops in their home if any of the local garrisons didn't have room for them. Well, this is a total invasion of privacy, and it has no respect for any type of any type of private property. But also the typical British soldier who was serving in the American colonies at that point, he wasn't your professional volunteer soldier who likely came from a well-to-do family and was well trained and well disciplined to begin with. The typical soldiers serving in the American contingent at that time were criminals who had gone before a magistrate, and the judge said, okay, you can go to the gallows, or you can join the army and serve out the rest of your sentence in the wilderness of the American frontier.
Wow.
And these are certainly not the kind of people that I want to be housing in my home.
Right.
So you have all of these repressive acts that are slowly building to a crescendo, and you think the situation's going to be diffused after the Boston Massacre, when British troops opened fire on some rowdy American protesters in front of the Customs House in Boston. So some of those acts were repealed, and some of the taxes were even repealed at that point. But then fast forward to 1773, and you have the Tea Act, which the tea market in Britain at that point was suffering from market oversaturation, and it was really starting to affect the prices on the international tea market. So what the British business tycoons and the British Parliament, for that matter, decided to do was, hey, well, we're going to take all of the surplus tea, we're going to sell it to the American colonists at all of these bargain basement prices, and then we're going to tax them on it. So this underhanded way of trying to undercut the tea surplus really rubs
Mhm.
Americans the wrong way. Especially since not only are they losing money, all of the tea merchants here are losing money. They're getting taxed on top of it. They're like, hey, this is pretty much your 1770s. It's pretty much your 1770s version of a Bernie Madoff scheme. So they, of course, start to fight back, and one of the most prominent examples of them rebelling against this horrible horrible tea cartel tactic that's going on is they respond with the Boston Tea Party, and that's when protesters, members of the Sons of Liberty, which was Sam Adams' protest group, they disguised themselves as Native Americans. They board a few merchant ships in Boston Harbor, and they dump all of the tea bags right over the railings into the harbor. Well, that costs British merchants and by default the British government a lot of money. So they reintroduce a lot of the oppressive acts that they had previously repealed, and then they established a new set of laws called the Intolerable Acts, and that's that's where they were restricting limits on your freedom of speech. That's where they were restricting limits on your freedom of assembly, and that point, it really became the point of no return for the American Revolution. It was the following year that you had the First Continental Congress, where they all got together, delegates from all of the colonies at that point.
Mhm.
And they said, okay, well, here at the First Continental Congress, here's what we're going to do. We are going to have a 100% boycott on all British made goods. We're going to hit them where we know it's going to hurt the most, and that's in the pocketbook.
Right.
We're also going to create what's called a Continental Association, which is going to enforce the boycott. So if we catch any merchants in any of the 13 colonies who are breaking the boycott, then we're going to be breaking your kneecaps. and not only that, they also declared the Intolerable Acts null and void. And
Wow.
it was shortly thereafter that they established the Continental Army. They started calling for local militias. And then in 1775, that's when you had Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, where the British were trying to take control of an armory right outside of Boston. And on the march to and on the march back, you had American militiamen who were lining the sides of the roads, picking off these British troops one by one as they were marching in these single file columns back to Boston.
Wow. That's an amazing story, even like how they did that with even the Boston Tea Party when they, dressed up like, hey, we're Indians doing this, and that part, it's smart, but I don't like it for the Indians,
Right.
For the indigenous people are like, hey, don't put us there. But when you put it all together in this way, and I actually do know more than I thought. Like now that it's like, oh yeah. But as you put it together, you painted this really this bubbling picture of heat, right? Of
Mhm.
everyone's getting a little angry, like we came here to get away. We wanted religious freedom, right? We came here for
Right.
religious freedom. And when you're talking about, okay, these intolerable acts and all of this, and privacy, and now I kind of really understand the backbone of what we vote for, and
Mhm.
and really what Americans say, hey, no, we want our privacy. We don't want this. We want this. We
Correct.
don't want that. So it's kind of our backbone of the country. All these, like, this is our value system as a
Mhm.
country, as a nation.
That's right.
But I also see some of these terms are actually used even today. I think even when we look at what happened at the Capitol building, that was some craziness. That kind of looked like what happened back in, the Revolutionary War times. Like,
Mhm.
hey, we're going to overthrow the Capitol, which obviously is not, the way to go.
Right.
But that's this thing. I mean, it's people want to fight over this now politically, and that's not what we're here to talk about. But I get it a little bit better in that these are some of these sets of values, and then isn't it Thomas Jefferson who pretty much wrote everything? And from
That's
when I
right.
was understand too, part of this was there was also part of the grumblings where like the westward expansion also kind of tied into this a little bit, right? Is people wanted to kind of move outside of the colonies. There were things were
Hmm.
starting to change from what they initially set up in the colonies.
Right.
Ah, okay, cool. And he did good. I mean, he stayed up day and night, and you know what it's like to stay up day and night and write something on a deadline.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, but think about it, you're writing it for a country, you
Hmm.
know? I mean, I
Exactly.
wonder what it felt like to be them writing this and then you have to put a wig on, you know,
Hmm.
and go, I mean, come on, why the wigs? Um, and then go in and you're representing an entire country, you
Yeah.
know, that's got to have some weight on the shoulders. I wonder if they've got any writings of that, like, dude, I just wrote this and it got adopted in. Like, you know what I mean? You know, so
Yeah.
that part of it is pretty crazy. But so so it really became militia army. So anybody who was anti, even though so it's like British against British on new soil, yet at the same time we also had the Native Americans that we kind of stomped over, you know. And weren't there other cultures that were on the, you know, on the continent as well? Not just British that were part of this? Or is it
Right.
mostly British on British?
Well, when we're talking about the American Revolution, it for the most part was British on British. But the thing was, is that at some point when we were fighting against the British, we actually enlisted the help of the French. And we had a number of French advisors who were attachés to the Continental Army. And then later on in the war, you had the French, pretty much who were fighting side by side alongside us. And then you also had a few Prussian advisors who were taking all of their classical warfare expertise that they had gained on the European continent, and they were parceling out that knowledge to the Continental Army. One of the most notable, if not the most notable, was a guy by the name of Baron von Steuben, and he was a Prussian soldier who really schooled the Americans in how to do close order drill and how to maneuver as a cohesive unit.
Wow. So this keeps going. This is,
Mm-hmm.
but so how, and by the way, the shot heard around the world, I thought that was a baseball term as well. What was,
Well,
I mean, wasn't there a baseball? I know, sorry, everybody, but it, you know, I know I'm American, but I'm still learning. I think we'll always keep learning, but isn't there a baseball thing with that or no? I
well,
really
I
have
think
no clue.
I don't know. I guess you could say the shot heard around the world was when Babe Ruth called his
Yeah.
shot. I think it was at the 1932 World Series where he pointed to the left center field bleachers and then hit a home run that which went exactly in the direction that he intended it to.
Oh, wow. See, but that's American history.
Yeah,
I
of course
mean,
it is.
come on, baseball is American. So it's
That's
okay for
right.
me to say this, bring that up, you know?
Yeah,
Okay,
for
so we have
sure.
these different cultures. We have French hanging out with us. So doesn't that tie into Canada too? Like, because I find it interesting that they're celebrating July 1st is their Canada Day. We have ours on the
Hmm.
4th.
Right.
Like, were we friendly at that time or not?
Well, Canada was
Because then we had the
very
Battle of 1812.
right. So Canada was still a dominion of the British government at this point, and they weren't necessarily involved in the revolution as much. But where we really see Canada start to become more involved was in the War of 1812, particularly during some of the disastrous opening rounds of that war that we had. When we talk about the War of 1812, the big flashpoint that comes to a lot of our minds is that when we tried to invade Canada, I mean, that was a disaster for American forces. We backed off of that pretty quickly because it ended so poorly for us. As a matter of fact, one of the things we can point to as a proverbial turning point in that War of 1812, actually, it's ironic when you think about it, because it wasn't really a land battle per se that started to turn the tides in our favor. It was a naval battle, but it wasn't a
Mm,
naval battle that happened on the high seas. And you have to remember, the Royal Navy was still the biggest and baddest kid on the block. It was a naval battle that happened in the Great Lakes. I mean, you had on Lake
amazing.
Erie, yeah, you had on Lake Erie a lot of these untested American ships who were going toe to toe against some of the best man of wars in the British fleet, and we completely decimated them at ranges that, as far as naval warfare is concerned, were really point blank range. You know, I mean, we were firing cannonballs at each other at ranges of less than 100 yards, and these were pretty big ships. And for us to get that close and to score that decisive of a victory over what was then the greatest navy on the planet, and for it to happen on a lake, I mean, that was like a huge boost to morale for a lot of us.
This is, that's why I know we're steering off of the Revolutionary War, but to me, it's all kind of connected in this interesting way. And, so we've been to Lake Erie. We went on the Pennsylvania side. You can go through Ohio too, right? So that lake keeps going.
Mhm.
We went out on the water, and Harry's Victory.
Yeah.
We went to one of his monuments, and man, he was a crazy dude. And
Mhm.
we were learning how and I know we talked about this before we started recording, how, they were sinking ships. I mean, there were all these tactics they were pulling that were still kind of new. And we went out on that water, and it's kind of interesting because there was some, there's lighthouses out there. And I always thought, why would you need a lighthouse on a lake? Well, yes, you do. And you really do. And when you're out there, you actually do feel like you're out on the ocean. That
Mhm.
lake, that lake can be pretty choppy. It it was pretty, it was, you could be out, you could be out in the middle of nowhere and think, if somebody just blindfolded you and put you out there, you wouldn't know if you were on the lake or the ocean. You know what I mean? If you didn't know where you were going and
Mm.
they just dropped you
Right.
off there, you wouldn't know. And it's, when you think about the wars being fought there, and then even the way the weather changes there, I mean, that some of the tide coming in freezes. And you live up in those northern areas, man. You guys are
Oh
like,
yeah.
guys are all got like thick skin out there. I don't know how you do it, but
Yeah.
I've tried. We do our little stints and we go, okay, we come running back south with our tail between the legs.
Mm.
But that's a fascinating battle. And then okay, I know I'm going ahead again, but then not the Battle of 1812, and then the Battle of New Orleans. What were the British doing there if they were already like told to go home from the Revolutionary War? If I got my dates mixed now, like
Well,
what were
so
they?
it's
Because the Scottish were there too. Like what? Like
well,
they were supposed to
well,
get out.
yeah, well, so we had the end of the American Revolution. We'll call that 1781. And then we had a pretty tumultuous relationship with Britain following the end of that war. Throughout the 1790s, we would have these little spats here and there, and we would have these tenuous peace agreements or whatnot. But right around the turn of the century, coming into the 1800s, that's when things start to get a little bit hectic again. And the Royal Navy is now harassing some of our ships on the high seas. Well, there's quite a few incidents, high profile incidents. One of them involving the USS Chesapeake versus the HMS Leopard. And the HMS Leopard captures what is at that point the pride of the American fleet. Not only that, you have the Royal Navy. They're capturing American merchant ships on the high seas, and they are impressing those sailors. They're like forcibly conscripting them into the Royal Navy. So this starts happening enough, and then finally, war is declared against Britain. So Britain, of course, sends their troops over here. Again, it's essentially the Revolutionary War Part Two, and
Oh,
yeah, and so throughout the War of 1812, which actually goes all the way until 1816. So right around the tail end of the War of 1812, we're talking like late 1815, early 1816. The culminating battle is at the Battle of New Orleans, and what they were doing at that point was, just trying to essentially trying to flank the former American colonies and strategically isolate certain parts of the colonies to make it easier to split our forces. The only thing that they didn't count on was what was the leadership of Old Hickory himself, Andrew Jackson. And the Battle of New Orleans was an incredible victory for us, because there were a lot of tactical tactical pieces of ingenuity that we had put forward on the field. One of which was putting our artillery forward of our main forces, and to be outmaneuvered as badly as the British were, it wasn't long before people could see, okay, this was an American rout. We had pretty much routed the British forces under General Packenham at that point, and it was a decisive victory, but it was almost kind of a Pyrrhic victory, because peace negotiations had already started at that point, but the information was slow to make its way to the frontline forces. But even still, that was, in a lot of ways, it was an effective bargaining chip on our part, because we could say, okay, well, yeah, you're ready to talk about peace. Well, God, look what just happened to your forces at New Orleans. And that was one of the things that solidified the Treaty of Ghent, which was in 1816. And that Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812. But, the lessons that we both took away from that war were so long lasting. We both realized, hey, the war wasn't really even necessary to begin with. And, for the betterment of the Western Hemisphere, we had better get along well with each other. And, the Treaty of Ghent set those terms of peace that have lasted for the better part of 200 years. And even today, after the Treaty of Ghent, the British are the one reliable ally that we Americans still have in the world.
Okay, so this was almost like the end of the Revolutionary War then, the Battle of New Orleans, the Treaty of Ghent kind of really said, okay, now we're really done. Because it's kind of like that. Even human relationships are like that. All right, we're done with this fight. We're putting it to bed. We've called a truce. And a year later, like, brothers will fight each other, or sisters, or loved ones,
and it's like, hey, do you remember the time when you did blah blah blah?
Don't use that card.
Yeah.
That card, you're supposed to, like, okay, it's in the past, we're done it, we know better. And then it, people will get resourceful even in their own arguments, right? And so that will happen in military and in battles. So okay, now so the Revolutionary War really just kept stretching out. So we're going to duke it out to the end. Right. But I thought it was interesting I know I keep talking to you about this battle because I just find it really fascinating how, Native Americans were coming in from Kentucky and Tennessee, and the Scottish were coming, the privateers were coming in. Now, okay, so everybody got together and said, that's enough of that. And it was Andrew Jackson, even though he was so bad to the Native Americans.
Oh, yeah.
He's the one who really made it all work. And he had to go and be polite to him. So he kind of had to own up and say, and didn't he have dysentery, as I recall, something like that? He was not well during that.
Yeah, he was frequently sick. Poor guy.
Well, maybe it is his attitude, but he really did a good job on that one. But okay, so now I have to go backwards to go forwards, because now the Louisiana Purchase was purchased prior to this war.
Correct.
And so that's a whole other weird thing, that the Louisiana Purchase, like it's like that whole, like we've talked about Louisiana no man's land at one point. The Spanish had it, the Italians, French. I mean, everybody started like owning it. And then all of a sudden it was back to being American, right? And nobody told American that's where it became no man's land, and no one ruled it. There was no law and order. And I think everybody had a good time, but you know what I mean? But it was because they didn't get the information. And I think it was waylaid in England. That's some crazy stuff. Now I have to go back on that. But the Louisiana Purchase, that's a weird thing how that really was a big part of our country now, even the makeup. And the Louisiana Purchase is not just the state of Louisiana, like how big it is,
Mhm.
but it was Louisiana back then.
Right.
So yeah. So did that come into play during the Battle of 1812 at all because it went so far up?
Well, yeah, it was because for the past, I don't know, for the past dozen years or so at that point, Louisiana and New Orleans were by every measure an American territory. So that the fact that we now own that land and it had ceased to be formally French, yeah, that was going to be a contested piece of territory until the War of 1812 was finally resolved. But it was a tremendous windfall for us because that added so much more territory to our country at that point. And then it was shortly after we acquired the Louisiana Purchase and we sent Lewis and Clark out to do their expedition there, to try to map out what was beyond the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And not only that, it also played a role in formalizing our relations with the Spaniards and later the Mexicans, because right around 1819 you had the Adams-Onis Treaty, which is how we ended up getting Spanish Florida, but it also formally defined where the Louisiana Purchase ended and where the Spanish-Mexican territory began.
Mm.
So yeah, because we had that amorphous landmass out there that was called Louisiana, but part 3 of that Adams-Onis Treaty was an agreement between the U.S. and Spain that says, okay, of all of this territory that you call the Louisiana Purchase, here's where it ends, and here's where we define the border of Spanish Mexico. And it wasn't but a few years later, after they formally defined that border, that Mexico was in its own Revolutionary War against Spain. And then of course you had American settlers who were settling in Spanish Tejas, and
That's right.
yep, and then that led to the Texas Revolution.
Right. And actually, when you go up in no man's land in Louisiana, and that no man's land really ended in 1821. So it was 1891 to 1821, 1891, yeah, to 1821, where it was. So this is kind of interesting, like how all of this, it's fast. It's just like this giant timeline of things that happen across America, right?
Right.
And then, but I want to go back even to 1812 because the War of 1812 and the British, that was happening in Washington State, like big time. And here we were like on these little islands. We went on Whidbey Island and we have actual, national park units and everything with this. They have a French camp, an English camp. There was Italian camps, there were British camps. And so everyone was fighting. And they managed to kind of, there was fighting times and then there were non-fighting times. And then someone killed a pig and then they fought. Because there was a pig that was running around the camps, and then someone killed the pig, and that was it. It was on. There was some story with that. I'm not telling it properly, but yeah. And I think I don't know if it was a British or an Italian that did it, and then it went crazy. So when we think about the War of 1812, like how far from the Revolutionary War time, how far we'd stretched out across the country already, and having these camps. And yet, so it seems like they were coming in from the other side to get us too, like England, with what's his name, Sir Francis Drake, coming through, tried to claim California, the new Albion, I think it is that he called it. And yeah, Sir Francis Drake and his golden hiney is like I always call him. But he ran ashore and he was going to claim it for the Queen. That didn't work, and he was fighting with the Spanish. So all this stuff was happening all at the same time. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, and how we were fighting. All the British, how the British were fighting with the Spanish, and they would do it at sea and just bomb each other and go right up. That's some crazy stuff,
Yeah.
So yeah. So when you go from the Revolutionary War, we got the 1812, got all these other little wars, not that they're little, but you know what I mean? So once we get independence of our country, then it was like, all right, now you know how to fight. You've got to keep fighting for it. You can't stop now. It was like,
Right.
it's kind of like that was the beginning of all the wars that America's gone through there.
Yeah, I
Wow.
mean, at least until the War of 1812, I mean, that's what pretty much put an end to that era of what we can
The
only call
British.
persistent conflict. Yeah.
And then the
Yes.
Civil War comes.
Right.
That had to be, I mean, because even that wasn't that, I mean, it was like 100 years, not even 100 years later,
That's
right?
right. Hmm.
So some people are already having memories of that. Do you think? Do you think the same people were there during the Revolutionary War? Some could have still been alive, but elder, right?
Oh
I don't
yeah,
know, because
yeah. Yeah, some of them were still alive at that point. I mean, they were very old, of course, and maybe
yeah,
they were approaching the end of their lives, but it was something that I think on some level a lot of us knew was coming, especially since even if you go back to the 18 teens and 1820s, you had various people talking about secession. But yeah, I think on some level, everybody knew that there were only so many compromises you can make between whether or not we were going to remain split between slave states and free states, or whether it was going to be an entirely free nation. And the founding fathers, they knew that it was going to be a very sticky. It was going to be a very sticky issue, one that they would not easily resolve probably within their lifetimes. But they said to themselves on some level, I think, okay, well, this may be a what's the word I'm looking for? This may be a
like a
centrifugal force against the
oh,
nation, and it might rip us apart, but let's try and put some things in place now that can keep that from happening. And hopefully, as time goes on, cooler heads will prevail. Because Ben Franklin had already started an abolitionist society on the continent
mm-hmm,
by the time the Constitutional Convention came around. So I
mm,
think, what they were telling themselves was, hey, this is only going to end one of two ways. It's going to be a nation that is permanently divided between slave and free, and the slave states are going to have to recognize that they're going to be in the minority, or slavery is just going to go away. It's either going to go away quietly, or it's going to go away with a lot of bloodshed. But those are the only two options that we foresee.
it's crazy because it's like another revolution, right?
Uh-huh.
When you think of it, it was just, it was like, okay, here's the descendants of, the Revolutionary War period. Here's, and now we're gonna like fight against each other. Now
Hmm.
that we've got independence, let's kill each other. And the slavery part was, it's horrific and it's happened around the world and it's unfortunate. But I want to also touch on at that time we had the 13 colonies and then that changed and we
Hmm.
became states. So there were colonies and then the territories out west, right? So we didn't have,
Yeah.
is that how it worked? Like the territories weren't in the east, they were only in the west?
Yeah, well, the unorganized and even the organized territories were out west, and we were still trying to define the borders of where they started and where they ended. Kansas and Nebraska just being one examples there. But yeah, as new territories were acquired and people started settling them, and these places started applying for statehood, then you had the nagging question of, okay, well, are these new states going to be slave? Are they going to be free?
Mm,
Are we going to try and geographically isolate them to one particular part of a map, or what? And that was leading to things like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, and every other compromise that people could think of to try and maintain that delicate balance between slave states and free states. And the
mm.
slave states actually took more of a panicked view of it, because they thought, okay, well, we know that there's a lot of people in the country who um, well, we'll have there are a lot of people in the country who want slavery abolished. So we don't want them to get too big of a voice in government, because if they outnumber us in Congress and in the Senate, they'll take it away from us, and we won't even have a say in the matter because,
Wow.
the majority will rule at the end of the day. So it was a balancing act that I don't think anyone could have found a long-term solution for, other than, hey, we're going to go to war over this and figure out what's what.
Wow. And then it's wild now when you think, well, they should have brought Thomas Paine back. He wrote the Common Sense, the booklet Common Sense. And I think that helped Jefferson maybe with his declaration. I thought Thomas Paine was pretty cool. But then he went to jail, didn't he? He ended up in jail and then out of jail but when you think about, okay, now we ended up with Alaska, then we took over Hawaii, and I do mean it that way. That's just my opinion. And then Puerto Rico. So when you were explaining what it was like, as our country, like before independence, and how we're like, okay, well, this is our new land, and now Britain, we're going to fight with Britain because we're British, and then we get taxed for it and all that, and all those other rules, which suck. We don't want to be taxed and all of that. What about Puerto Rico? I mean, we end up with Puerto Rico, and they're not a state, but yet they are part of us. You know what I mean? Isn't it kind of similar for them, how they misfeel? I'm not trying to be political, but it's an interesting setup. Let's put it that way. How they're part of America, but they're not in a way. They're not allowed to vote, right? Or are they? If they're here in the mainland, they can, right?
Well, if they have residency inside of a state, yeah, they can. But Puerto Rico, we actually acquired them as a commonwealth after the Spanish-American War, and for a U.S. Commonwealth, it's a really weird legal dynamic if you have a commonwealth, because if you go to Puerto Rico, it is U.S. territory. All the people who live in Puerto Rico and who were born there, they are U.S. citizens. But yet they can't vote in presidential elections, and neither can the folks who live in Guam. And they have they have all other legal rights afforded to them by virtue of being American citizens. It's a commonwealth, yeah, but it's not a state. So I think you can call a commonwealth I think the most logical analogy I can give is it's almost like how we were with the British 250 years ago.
That's why I was saying, when you were telling me, I was like, that's kind of like what Puerto Rico was like.
Right.
Is like now.
Yeah. Except our relationship with Puerto Rico isn't really antagonistic. No, there are some political parties in Puerto Rico who want independence, and it's come up for vote every few years.
Yeah, it does.
But most Puerto Ricans have gone on the record to say, no, we want to stay part of the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting with that, and you hear that every election time, and then and there's people, it's almost like they're a territory, right? Like you're saying, it's like a commonwealth, and we have Virgin Islands and those kind of, and sometimes those are from wars, right? And so like our National Park Service, we have all these sites in places like America Samoa, those places. But then at the same time, so Puerto Rico, you can't do these things. So you can get an American passport. There you go. There's something. So that comes up. Okay, so Washington, D.C. And I was like, I got all confused even when we were driving and getting lost there. Thank you. That was fun.
Okay.
Yeah. So DC, they cannot vote, right? If you live in Washington, DC. And so it is or it isn't part, like the District of Columbia.
Oh,
So
well,
that's still kind of what is going, because they want to become, aren't they trying to change too? And then everyone I know that lives there says, no, it's not going to ever happen.
Well, there's some people who have wanted DC to become a state, but if you live in DC proper, you can still vote in elections. DC doesn't have any representation in the federal government, though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, because what is it? this last election, they were running a lot of the exit polls for the polling stations in DC. And yeah, there was like, for like the past, I don't know, 70 years or so, DC has voted overwhelmingly Democratic. Yeah.
Mm. This is fascinating. So, Mike, you've basically given us the overview of the history of America. You did
Yeah, pretty
good.
much. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think I know you made sense. Well, because we all read different pieces. It's hard to put it into one picture, but it is really interesting going from the Revolutionary War and how it stretched out, So it makes more
Mhm.
sense to me. When you put things into a context like that, it just you can understand how, okay, the ripple effect of one thing to the next. And it
Mhm.
just makes sense of, I heard this term today in an interview about how history doesn't just, you don't just turn the chapter. History stacks itself, and
Yeah.
it's always connected with the stacks. And that's exactly what you just proved today to me. And you gave me a good, reminder lesson of our American history. And I'm sure we all forget our American history here and there, I think in
Yeah.
election times when people get all angry with each other's political beliefs and start arguing it, I'm hoping that we read back in these, stories and the story of our country to remember what the values were really for and about, maybe be a little nicer,
Mhm.
and come together, instead of split, but, it's doing what it's doing. But it is
Right.
interesting looking backwards and then looking at today. It's kind of, I see all these similarity lines going, ooh, I don't want that. I don't want to have a tea party again. I like
Yeah.
tea. I like
Mhm.
my tea. But yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. So I think you should, you do so well in teaching history, and I know you teach. You have a master's in teaching in history, right?
I do.
Yep. I think then maybe you should write a book or two. I'm just messing with
Okay.
you. 25 books. It's 25, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so what's next? What's the next book?
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. The two projects in the hopper right now are one on the combat engineers in Vietnam, and then another one on the spy war in Bosnia.
I can't wait for the one on the spy war of Bosnia because
Yeah, I
it just
think it's.
it feels very connected to my childhood,
Mhm.
We're watching what was happening there. And so you've done a lot of different wars. Would you ever go and write something from like the 17, 1800s? Or
Oh,
do you want
sure.
to, you would?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Cool. I hope you do. Because it's cool.
Me too.
Because you always tell the stories of the people. And
Mm-hmm.
when going back to the Revolutionary War, is there anybody that you think, you would want to shine the spotlight on from that time era, or that, main that war, whichever one you want to talk about, the ripple effect of it all, that you would say
Mm-hmm.
was, outstanding or just really needs to have the light shone on them?
Yeah, I would probably say, and there are a lot of them, but I would probably focus my attention on a guy named Francis Marion. They called him the Swamp Fox, and he fought down in the Carolinas. And this guy was a master of guerrilla warfare, engaging in a guerrilla war against the British contingent down in the Carolinas. And they called him the Swamp Fox because that's where, he operated out of. He would be in and out of the swamps, and he would be fighting. You'd be fighting the British using irregular tactics, and not try to give them an opportunity to present an enemy with whom they could close with through maneuver, because he was just in and out of the shadows. So most historians of the war, they know Francis Marion, but I think he probably deserves a wider mainstream audience, and
Wow.
and something that would just something that would make his story known to the masses.
Yeah, I don't even think about it all the way down into South Carolina, you
Yeah.
know? What was it was it South Carolina then? Or was it the
Yeah, it
Carolinas?
was. Yeah, it was mostly South Carolina.
Wow, there's gators in those swamps. I've
Uh-huh.
gone to those swamps,
Yeah.
and copperheads and
Mhm.
cottonmouths.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that's amazing. Amazing what people go through during war, man. And now
Mhm.
we have to tell people not to, play with the bison inside the or the buffalo. Is it bison or buffalo? I'm going to get in trouble. Inside of Yellowstone. Don't take your picture next to the alligator. Like, duh. Yeah,
Right.
back in the day, people were fighting alongside gators and snakes. Amazing. Well, we can't wait for the next books, and we can't wait for next month. We're going to be talking about communication in war, right? So does
Mhm.
that include like Morse code and all of that, flags, as I was learning the other day? Just how communication was done, and what we were talking about before with Normandy Beach, how they were able to communicate when they landed.
That's right.
Very cool. Everyone, MikeGuardia.com is the website. He's here every first Monday. You can keep up with us at BigBlendRadio.com. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's always a pleasure to be on the show.
I appreciate the history lesson. Thank you.
Anytime.